I'll give a fair amount of historical background here. Geoffrey Chaucer was born sometime in the 1340s. The date is not secure, and he died in 1400. He was a courtier and diplomat, and is acclaimed to be the father of English literature. This position was afforded him because of the dynamism of the times. The 1300s, as we touched on last week with Catherine of Siena, were a difficult, it was a difficult to get through, but it was also an era in which an immense amount of new forces were unleashed. This is in historiography the great conundrum about how the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance overlap, depending especially on whether you're talking about Italy or England. The Trecento, the 1300s, of course, is the great age of Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio. And then you get the full flowering the following centuries. These are the waning days of the Middle Ages, and yet at the same time, the beginning of something new. The calamities we've mentioned in the past, of course, the great mortality, the Black Death, which depopulated in astonishing way the lands of Europe, especially of Northern Europe. The forces unleashed by war, which are always devastating, but also tend to shake things up. And so let's look at a few of these factors. Chaucer was caught up in a time where the 100 Years' War was engulfing England and France. He served under Edward III, who had inherited this war from decades past. There had been a long-standing feud because English kings were also at the same time, given their holdings on the continent in France, were at the same time vassals of the French king, and that very fraught relationship led to ongoing tension. So whenever the French king wished to humiliate the English king, he would summon the English king as a vassal to the French court. Eventually, this would lead to what we now know as the 100 Years' War. This required a coincidence of a few factors. The ongoing humiliation of being a vassal, even though he was a king, Edward III, was the Duke of Aquitaine. Therefore, that is the region of southwestern France, Gascony, meant that by virtue of that title, he had to answer to the King of France. This humiliation was vexing, but it coincided during Edward III's reign with the end of the Capetian line, which had been so strong for so long without any break in the line of succession, and had been able to conquer back the Angevin Empire, that huge amount of land that England had managed to acquire in French territory. With the accession of Philip VI, the Valois took over from the Capetians. The French were involved in intrigues against England, especially with their alliance with Scotland. So Edward III was trying to deal with this opportunity of the end of the Capetian line, but also dealing with the problems he had inherited in terms of the weird vassal relationship. And so the 100 Years' War began in 1337 and would not end until 1453. It was sporadic, but this carried on something that Edward I had already, he reigned from 1272 to 1302. He had already inaugurated this era of perpetual war so that Englishmen would not know a decade without war for basically, well, certainly through the rest of the 1300s. The pressure that war brings about, you have loss of life, of course, but also the immense need to fund operations, and that led to taxes and an increasing tax burden, direct taxation of all the classes, which was not, that was a novelty when it first happened. So you have here, in general, with England, the strongest monarchy in Europe, asserting itself as a hereditary monarchy, which leads, of course, to the difficulties of a hereditary monarchy. That is, you can get stuck with a ruler who's incompetent or is too young, and so on. So there were, eventually you would see the kinds of depositions and murders of kings and children of kings that remind one of the Roman Principate, in which you see in the history plays of Shakespeare. This is all afoot in the period that we're looking at here. The English monarchy was the strongest in Europe and over the years had to contend with the growing self-assertion of the nobility, and that led to the growth of Parliament. Despite all of these difficulties, Chaucer seems to have maintained his position as a court favorite despite all of these machinations. He was a close friend of John of Gaunt, the one we read about in Shakespeare, the Duke of Lancaster, who was one of the children of Edward III. And in fact, they would be, Chaucer and John would be related by marriage eventually when Chaucer married Philippa, who was the sister of one of John's later wives. This pattern of preferment, you can see Chaucer was entrusted with various royal positions, controller of customs, justice of the peace. He was even a member of Parliament in 1386. So he was a trusted figure. People clearly thought highly of his integrity. When he was younger, he had gone with Edward III on the campaign in France, and in fact was captured at Reims and had to be ransomed, and the king ransomed him. There in France, it is assumed while he was imprisoned, he came across the Romance of the Rose, and he translated that, and that's important. Of course, we treated that in the great conversation. That premier work of courtly romance had its effect on Chaucer, though, as we see in the Franklin's Tale, he's playing around with the coordinates that he's been given. He would, on diplomatic missions, go to Italy twice, and the first time in 1372 to Genoa and Florence. And it is assumed that, I think rightly, that he would have come across the work of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, and of course the importance of the Decameron of Boccaccio as a massive set of stories set within a frame. It's clear that had an influence on the plan of the Canterbury Tales, though there are differences. Besides the turmoil of war, there was the fact of the great mortality, the Black Death, which gave the upper hand to the peasants because there were so few people to run the estates, and they were therefore asking for more in terms of wages, and in the despotic way that kings will sometimes be, there were statutes, and with the collusion of the nobles, there was the statute of laborers that was passed as a law to control wage prices to pre-Black Death levels. It was an absurd kind of an evil proposition. This would lead to the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, a bloody uprising, and it may have been the case that Chaucer would have seen the events from his house atop, at that time, one of the London gates, Aldgate. Other factors of turmoil in the 1300s, you have the Great Papal Schism from 1378 to 1417. Last week we talked about the Babylonian captivity. After Catherine Siena was able to get the Pope back from Avignon back to Rome, the church fell into its own internal schism. It's an after effect because the rival claimant to the papal throne was a French Pope, and backed by the French cardinals, so back in Avignon, and eventually there would be three claimants to the papacy. This was, again, devastating to the mind of Christian Europe, because if the papacy meant anything, it had to be unity, and you didn't know who to follow. So that was profoundly disorienting and dispiriting. Edward III passed in 1377, and his son, the Black Prince, had already died as a result of war. So Richard II was the grandson, and he took over while still a child, so he was in minority. In 1389, he claimed sovereignty over the objections, the Lords Appellant. So this was, again, immense intrigue. But through it all, Chaucer was there, prospering as a civil servant, and clearly writing a lot of poetry. And the more direct social factors here, and what makes Chaucer, set him up to be the father of English literature, you can see in terms of the shift from French to English, even as the court language. Part of that was under the pressure of war. I mean, who wants to speak the language of the enemy? When the Norman invasion had happened in 1066, the French upper class was the English upper class that conquered was a French-speaking population. So it was only in the late 1300s when the shift to English was occurring. And Chaucer's genius is what set that language on its firm path. And that's why he really does have a very real claim to being called the father of the English language, of English literature. His dialect was, we call now, Middle English, and I will read the first lines of the general prologue in the original. We have a very good, I think, translation by Neville Coghill in our selections today, but you will see they are rhymed couplets, and it is iambic pentameter, but the sound is going to sound foreign. If you read it, you can work through it, and after a while, it is not the easiest thing to read. Chaucer was the son of a wine merchant, and that indicates that his class positioning was not in the aristocratic, but in the new men of the merchant class. And this class was beginning to become literate. You have to be literate to deal with all of the business matters. And so you have an audience now that's ready to read poetry, especially. There was a great hunger for poetry. And in times of crisis, I think, I speak as a poet, I hope anyway, that poetry is something that people will come to think of as a resource. There was increasing literacy because of this. There was also because of this movement that John Wycliffe was associated with, the Lollards, that insisted on the need to read the Bible oneself as opposed to having it simply be filtered through clerics. And that's the other thing that we need to, the clerical class were generally the priests. They were the ones who could read, and they usually filled the government posts. The fact that Chaucer could fill all of these posts as a layman indicates how much of a shift it happened. That was happening right at his time. Another factor is that London became the settled capital of England. That wasn't the case. The court had been used to moving around. It was itinerant. And because so many Midlanders had come into London, it would be the Midland dialect that would be the one that would determine the ultimate shape of the language. So I will now read the beginning of the Canterbury Tales. Oh, a few things, words about this work, which is his great culminating work. It's 24 stories, 17,000 lines. It is not complete, at least not by the, well, it isn't complete. Whether or not Chaucer was okay with its incompletion, there's some indication it had such great popularity right after his death that it seems as if this may have been what he had planned somehow, that he made a peace with not having a fully realized work. You've got 30 pilgrims on the way to Canterbury to honor the shrine of Thomas of Becket, who was killed as a result of Henry II, the beginning of the Plantagenet line that is still playing out. So there's a kind of, it seems to me, subversive angle here, which it's amazing that Chaucer was able to balance such free thought with preferment in these circles. These 30 pilgrims we read about in the general prologue, and it's just a beautiful powerful representation of a lot of the forces that I've just mentioned, and Chaucer is able to encapsulate all of this. It is remarkable. Very few poets are able to contain as many worlds as Chaucer does. The point of going on pilgrimage to Canterbury is as an act of penance, and that's the spirit that, if there is one general spirit that pervades the work, that would be it. So the beginning of the general prologue. On that Aprillo with his sure sorte, the rocht of marsh hath sit to the rote, and bathed every vine switch liqueur, of which vertu engendris the flour. On Zephyrus egg with his sweet breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tender cropus, and the younger sonna hath in the ram his halfa coursirona. And smaller fools maken melodia that slepen out the nicht with openia. So pricketh him natuur in hier courages, than longen folk tog on pilgrimages. And palmeres for to seken stranges strandes, to verna houes, couth and sonderlandes. And specially, from every sheeres ende of Engeland to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to seke, that hem hath holpen one that they were seke. The questions. With which of the pilgrims would you most enjoy spending time? In the general prologue, how are secular ways of existing treated in comparison with Christian ways? How does the Franklin's Tale record a shifting sensibility with regard to the relation of marriage and romantic love? And number 4, how does the Franklin's Tale indicate what might be called a modern and ironic willingness to subvert and reorder various traditional life scripts? I look forward to this discussion.